Everyone's clapping, but I haven't even said anything yet, right? I could just leave the screen. Hope you've had a good morning. We're going to dive right in. The topic for my presentation this morning is this: identity, imagination, and the waters of your life. Now, I realize that means very little to you right now, but it will make a whole lot more sense in about 30 minutes. To start, I want you to imagine this. I want you to imagine a mother holding an 8-week-old baby. For those who don't know, it's about that big. 8-week-old baby. I want you to imagine her walking along a busy and yet intimate street. Imagine that she reaches the end of the street and stops at a corner. Now, imagine yourself closer. Imagine you can see the woman. She's holding the baby tightly, and with tears streaming down her cheeks, she whispers something into the baby's ears that we can't hear. And now watch as she gently places the baby onto that corner and that stone step, turns, and walks away forever. And you see the baby? You see a 2-month-old lying all alone? That's my daughter Anna. It's a picture of her the day that she joined our family in China. And my wife and I have literally stood on that corner, and we have walked down that street. If you can believe it, Anna is not my only daughter that has such an original story. My other daughter, Ivy, too, has her own story. Different birth mother, different part of China, the same kind of street, same trauma, same loss, same abandonment. But if you can really believe it, what makes my daughters pop isn't the fact that they're Asian and my wife and I aren't. It's that they're amputees and they wear prosthetic legs. Anna wears a prosthetic for her right leg. Ivy is a double above the knee amputee. And the reason I tell you their story this morning is because it helps to inform my interest in identity. Because my daughters will have to answer questions I, as a white kid growing up in Indiana, have never thought to ask. Who am I? Where do I belong? And what can I do? Because my girls are internationally adopted amputees with prosthetic legs. Is that it for them and their identity? If they were to walk into school, we've got them pegged, right? Or is there hope for something more? That's what we're going to unpack. If you were to actually spend time in the really boring books on identity, you would look at books like this, and they are boring, but they're really informative. But what many of them will say is this, that you, each of you in this room, construct an identity around various ways. We want an identity, each of us right now has our own, that is continuous over time, despite the kind of storms that life throws at you. We want it to give us kind of good self-esteem, make me feel good about myself. We want it to allow us to be distinct from others and yet still belong in kind of whatever tribe I am or that I like, all while allowing me to do something in this world, to have this sense of what they call efficacy. And what the books argue is that those 5 that I kind of self-construct and that I put together all then inform this sense of meaning in my life. That if I do a good enough job kind of putting the puzzle pieces together, then I can have meaning that I get to self-construct. That sounds really good, and yet it assumes that you have a lot of ownership and autonomy over your life. It assumes what this terrible book assumes, and if you like it, I'm sorry, but all the places you'll go, it's often read at high school graduations. And on the second page, let me just read what it says for you there. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes. You can steer yourself any direction you choose. You're on your own, and you know what you know, and you are the guy who will decide where to go. But tell me, how do you decide where to go? Like in Frozen 2, do the next right thing. What is the next right thing? Just something I get to self-construct and put together? What this missing is what Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre says is this: I can only answer the question of what am I to do? I can only answer that question, like if I'm in that story, what am I to do, if only I answer the prior question of what story am I a part? Because if I know the story, if I know the ending, then it makes the direction much clearer. And I can ask you rhetorically, which means don't answer, what story are you a part of this morning? Do you have any idea? Or is it just kind of day out, day in, self-constructed meaning, whatever I feel like today? You're heading towards a story whether or not you know it. This sense of story, more properly told, is called a telos, or telos. That's just a fancy Greek word that means end or purpose. And for the classical Greeks, and for Aristotle in particular, there's an answer to this question. What is human life for? What are the marks of a life lived well? And again, I could ask you rhetorically, what is your human life for? Have you thought about it? Do you have any idea? Or like in the places you go, you're just going to see where the wind or where you think you will take you. Have fun with that. And let me ask you, at the end of your days, or at the end of high school, how do you know you lived high school well? Do we have any marks for that? Do we have any understanding for what that looks like? What all of this assumes is what René Descartes famously said, and you're probably familiar with this phrase, I think, therefore I am. Right? My thinking is what allows me to identify who I am, all these marks of what I'm going to be day in and day out. And that's true at some extent. We are in a school, I'm a teacher, thinking is really important. And yet it assumes you are a thinking thing, nothing more, nothing less. And I want to challenge this as it relates to our identity. In order to do that, let me offer the work of Soviet filmmaker Andrei Tarkovsky and his 1979 masterpiece, Stalker. The film Stalker follows two men and their guide on a long trip to an elusive room because they are told that in this room they will receive their heart's most desire. That is, in the room, they will get exactly what they want. And after a long, arduous journey, it's like 2 hours into the movie, the men arrive and they are literally at the threshold of entering the room when their guide reminds them, remember, your most sincere wish will be made true here. And it's at that moment that the men hesitate, literally, as it now dawns on them, what if I don't want what I think I want? After all, the room gives them their most sincere wish, not what they think they wish for. And the corresponding existential crisis the men face is if they don't even know their most sincere wish, do they even know who they are as a human being? And so it brings us back to this notion of I think, therefore I am. And again, we're going to reject this. Not entirely, but we're going to reject it some as it relates to your identity. And instead, I want to embrace a concept called a social imaginary. Now, it sounds like something I've just made up. Rest assured, if I made up this concept, I probably wouldn't be here in Wisconsin. Don't take that personally. No, it's been written about a lot. The social imaginary. Chief among them has been the work of Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor, who wrote this. And we're going to unpack this, so stick with me, and then we're going to make it understandable. Don't worry. A social imaginary is this: a set of assumptions most of us make about life before we think about it. Precognition, pre-worldview. We talk about lenses, pre-lens. A set of assumptions you make, just things that are given in your life that you don't even think about, to the extent that it'd be very difficult for you to imagine the world otherwise. That we can't even fathom taking it away, much like people that become amputees. We take our ability for granted until you get into a car accident and you can't walk. Your social imaginary is suddenly really effective beyond what you think. A set of assumptions most of us make about life before we ever think about it. Now, I know that's kind of a heady thought, so let me put it this way. This is an old parable. This says there's two young fish swimming in the ocean. They're just swimming along, and after a while they see an old fish swimming towards them. And they get close, and the old fish looks at them and he says, "Hello, boys, how's the water?" The young fish just ignore him. And after a while, one of the young fish looks over to the other one and says, "What's water?" Right? The water's the whole world, literally. Like, how do you not know that you're living in water? Well, a fish doesn't. So, a social imaginary, what kind of water are you living in that you don't even know that has a huge effect? How you breathe if you're a fish, the kind of strokes you use if you're a fish. You put a freshwater fish into the ocean and it's not going to survive. The kind of water that you're swimming in makes a big difference. Another definition for social imaginary before I move on, because this is critical to our identity. Social imaginary is this: pre-theoretical understandings and practices. Pre-thinking, understanding, things that you know and things that you do. So just think about that. Things that we take for granted, the kind of water we live in. that you acquire, not that you learn in school or learn from your parents, literally, not undermining schools, things that you acquire from the water around you, your communities, your families, etc., 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 etc. That's the notion of a social imaginary. It's growing up or putting yourself into a certain kind of water that is your whole world and life, and that dictates how you kind of move around without even thinking about it, in a way. So, one takeaway so far is this. Your identity is less the result of what you think it is compared to the kind of water that you swim in, the way that that shapes and forms you as a fish, as a water, and the way that that potentially directs you towards a different purpose for your life. There are conservative voting people right here in Wisconsin and liberal folks out in New York that probably disagree and have really different identities and probably live in the same waters around a lot of like authenticity and all this stuff. They live in the same exact kind of water as it relates to their identity. Here's the challenge though for you, as you're thinking about your identity. Okay, so what kind of waters do I swim in that potentially affect who I am and what kind of life I'm living? Well, it's really hard to know. Just like a fish doesn't know that it's in water, scholars say there's a veiledness, that it's hidden. You can't quite see it. That's the whole point. That's why it's so hard. It could be macro, though, really big picture, like the Copernican Revolution, when Nicholas Copernicus dared suggest that the sun and not the earth was at the center of the solar system, a reality which sent shockwaves through Europe as people grappled with their place in the cosmos now that they were no longer in the center. Your social imaginary and the things that affect your life could be quite personal, like finding out that your dad is the bad guy, which if you're a fan of Star Wars, shifts the entire series. Or more recently, like finding out that the teacher you hate, and that is like the manifestation of evil, has been caring for you in his own way the entire saga. Spoiler. It can also be much more mundane, our social imaginary, in terms of what shapes the kind of water that you're living in. Like this. Is it possible that this is creating in me a kind of water that creates a kind of identity that I may or may not like? Now, don't worry, this isn't going to be anti-tech. I like my smartphone a whole lot, and I have no intentions of getting rid of it. But it is a very powerful tool that shapes you just as much as you use it. As one author said in a recent presentation, from the moment a young person gets her own smartphone, she knows she's gaining access to what? I have a 9 and 10-year-old. What do they know they're gaining access to? TikTok? Instagram? No, they don't even know those apps exist. What are they gaining access to? Why do they want it so much? Because they see my wife and I on it. They're gaining access to a mode of life that's perpetually filled with possibility. They see everyone around them on their phones enchanted by something that's not there. And they think, I want to be a part of that. That's how it's so seductive in a way. That gets at what one mid-20th century French philosopher who never saw a smartphone in his life called the hidden persuasion of an implicit pedagogy. Pedagogy meaning teacher. Is it possible, just possible, that this is one of the most important, unfortunately, teachers in my life? That it trains and instructs and orients my view, not just to something on the screen, but to a way of living. Is it possible? Just possible. If you've seen this documentary, probably your parents have, it shouldn't be any surprise the phones do this to us. I'm not going to get into that too much. Now, you might be thinking, this seems so kind of academic and philosophical. I mean, it is just a phone, just as an example. It's like, yeah, you're right, just a phone. Let me ask you, has anyone here lost their phone? How do you respond? Do you respond like Rodin's thinker? And you're like, okay, I need to retrace my steps. I'm no longer able to text friends or access this. No, you respond like a social imaginary. And how do you respond? You freak out! Trust me, have you ever lost your phone? It's more important than your wallet, am I wrong? At least I freak out more if I lose my phone. My whole life is in there. That's the point. It's like the set of assumptions you make about life before you ever think about it, to the extent that it becomes very difficult to imagine otherwise, until you lose your phone and those set of assumptions are gone overnight. And you're suddenly like, what do I do with myself? You're swimming in new waters, and it's really uncomfortable in that way. This begs the question, if our social imaginary, the kind of water that we swim in, is that vital to who you are as a person, your identity, and potentially how that orients you towards a different purpose. And you might think, I don't care about my purpose. You're living into a story whether or not you know it. If it's that important, what influences it? Our heart's desires and our daily liturgies. We're going to unpack that first one, although I realize when I say heart's desires, that conjures up some kind of Disney motif or something really cheesy. I suppose that's true to some extent. But I'm not talking about Disney here. I'm talking about what King Solomon recognized. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. He doesn't say guard your mind. And rest assured, there's plenty of scriptures that deal with being sober-minded. And yes, I get it, I'm a teacher. But Solomon doesn't tell us that. Everything you do comes out of your heart. Your identity, that's the point of social imaginary and how it's creating a certain kind of waters for you. Chief among the people who have written about this is a professor at Calvin University in Michigan, Jamie Smith, who said, don't just think of sappy emotion, the heart. Don't think of that. Think of it as the fulcrum, the pivot of your most fundamental longings. A visceral means intuitive, subconscious orientation of the world. Guess what he's describing this after the ellipse there? A social imaginary, a visceral, subconscious orientation to the world. That's what your heart gives and provides. Perhaps it's no surprise then that theologians across thousands of years have all discussed the importance of the heart. St. Augustine, the desire of your heart is what constitutes your prayer. Let me ask you again rhetorically, what is the desire of your heart this morning? And I don't mean to get out of here or get home. What is the fundamental desire of your heart today? Have you ever even thought about it? I certainly don't think about it that much. But that desire forms in me a certain kind of identity, whether or not I know it. Thomas Cranmer, one of his biographers, said this: according to his anthropology, his understanding of the human person, what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies. Note the order there. It's not, what do I think that affects what I love? No, what do I love? What do I give myself over to? I suddenly start to justify rationally up here. That's really convenient, right? Let's turn to your boy, Martin Luther. That to which your heart clings and entrusts itself is really your God. Again, I could ask you rhetorically, what does your heart cling to this morning? What do you think you couldn't live without? For me, I think of my kids and things like that. That's great. Is that really the desire of my heart? Or do I feel relief when I drop them off from school? Something I got to think about, right? Our final theologian here, sometimes the smallest things take the most room in your heart. Anyone know what theologian said that? It's Winnie the Pooh. It actually doesn't even relate to the rest of these things. I just had to fit Winnie the Pooh in there just a little bit. I secretly like to think he's wondering, why aren't I wearing any pants? But you know what? In the original books, he's not even wearing a shirt, so it's Disney who put the shirt on him. So that's our heart's desires. What about our daily liturgies? These two go hand in hand. Again, Jamie Smith has been chief among this. We hear liturgies and we think possibly of a church, whether or not you know it, that the church service is set up in a certain way. And it's like, yeah, that's true. Churches have liturgies, but guess what? So does the rest of your life. Liturgies, whether sacred or secular, whether spiritual or not, they shape you by forming your most fundamental desires. I want to offer a broader definition than that. Liturgies are the ongoing practices, the habits, the rituals. Just think of those. The things that you do reflexively, constantly, day after day after day. If it's piano or soccer, that's a great liturgy. But you are involved in other kinds of liturgies that you're doing constantly. Practices, habits, and rituals that slowly, over time, shape and form what you love and who you are. Again, we know this. Anyone that's an athlete or musician knows that the liturgies of practicing and the rituals pays off. So what are the other kind of liturgies in our life in a non-church sense? The reason this is so powerful, liturgies are, is because we practice them. We practice being on our phones, just as an example. Hour by hour. You can't help but take it out. How many of you, if you're allowed to have a phone in the school, at least I see at Concordia, almost every student is walking, looking at their phone from class to class. It's 30 seconds, right? And yet that's the liturgy that we give ourselves over to. The late novelist, David Foster Wallace, had this to say, that our liturgies, and he's talking about things that we worship in our life, are just default settings. You can pull the phone out of your pocket, just default settings that you gradually slip into day after day after day. You're not even fully aware what you're doing, and slowly over time that's creating a kind of water that maybe you just don't want to be in. Or maybe you do want to be in if it's a good liturgy in that sense. So this is the picture of how our identity works. Our heart's desires, our daily liturgies work together in tandem to create this certain kind of non-cognitive, non-thinking way of being in the world that slowly orients me towards a different way of being. And if we're just playing off of the phone, it could be anything. It's amazing how most social commentators who speak to, it doesn't matter if it's your age or my 95-year-old grandmother, that most Americans seem to be really consumeristic. Whether or not you're actually buying things, right? Really consumeristic, which is everything has to be on demand, just this notion of being permanently connected. No one wants to live in those waters. No one. You don't either. And I don't mean you have to give up your smartphone. Now, I realize, though, you can be forgiven for thinking, I get the connect the dots here. I'm just not sure I'd buy it. Fair enough. But let's just take the first one. In response, I could ask you, how do we learn to be consumeristic in our world? How do I learn to be a consumer? Not because somebody comes along and makes an intellectual argument as to why buying things will make me happy. I don't think my way into consumerism. Rather, I'm covertly conscripted into a way of life precisely because the practices I've engaged in for decades are nothing less than liturgical. Nothing less than dispositional, nothing less than formative. That's the hidden persuasion of implicit pedagogy. And what Felicity Wu Song says, the problem isn't that we don't know that, it's that we lack respect for anything that's non-cognitive. It seems artistic or fuzzy, and yet that visceral, liturgical nature of our lives is what forms us more than anything that you think about yourself. And to come back to David Foster Wallace, I want to play off this notion of just gradually slipping into these liturgies, day after day after day. And he later in his talk speaks about that as putting on clothes, putting on clothing. And so that's what I want to stick with as it relates to our identity. This, the clothes that you are putting on, the clothes meaning the daily practices, habits, and rituals start to form what you actually care about, not what you think you care about, which creates in you a certain kind of water, orients you towards a certain purpose for your life. All whether or not you know it. And so I could ask you, what's your telos? What's your purpose? We could do a parent share, and you could tell your neighbor. And you know what? I don't care what you think your telos is. Most of us don't know. That's the point. Instead, what I'm interested in is what clothes are you wearing? By clothes, I mean, what are the rituals of your life? We're going to unpack that in just a second. And I don't just mean your day-to-day schedule. What are the rituals of your life that you give yourself over to without even thinking about it, and that shapes your mind more than the other way around? What clothes are you wearing? So take a deep breath. That's some heavy lifting. We're going to do some application, although it's going to be hardly application because it's really hard to just apply some of this, but we're going to take a stab at it. I've got 3 things in my remaining 7 minutes here. The first is this. If you are really serious about trying to figure out what would those daily liturgies be, what would be my non-cognitive set of assumptions I take for granted about this life before they're taken away, you got to step outside of yourself, or better yet, you got to have someone help you do that. You got to get out of the fishbowl and determine what kind of waters you're living in. I would call this a liturgical audit, right? Just an examination of the habits of your life. And you could consider, don't worry, we're not going to actually do this right now, but considering your hourly, daily, weekly routines, your habits, your practices, your rituals, the things that you do constantly and reflexively, you could consider these kinds of questions. How are those habits, practices, etc., shaping you? Not the other way around. How does the fact that I used to, after I put my kids in bed, I sat down with this for 30 minutes, scrolling through academic Twitter, How does that start to shape me, rather than just think that it's a tool that I use? As Neil Postman, one author from the 1980s, said, we used to use tools for the hand, but now our tools shape our minds. That was in the 1980s. Tools that shape the mind. I don't like the sound of that. So that's one question you could consider. What kind of water are you swimming in? What kind of telos does that point you to? And have you even considered the purpose of your life beyond what you perhaps were taught when you were 8, which you were probably taught something good. But what's that mean to you? Who can help you better understand the waters of your life? The non-cognitive way that you engage in the world. If you were to step into Andrei Tarkovsky's room, the room that gives you exactly what you want, your most sincere wish, and not what you think you wish for, what would you get? And if you care to know, in the movie, one man, he wants his brother to be saved, who's dying. He steps into the room, steps out. His brother has died, and he himself is now a rich man. That's a challenging, most sincere wish. Or finally, what kind of story do the frequent practices tell about your life? The things that you do, what do they tell about your life? Now, I'm not interested in answers to this right now, because that's what you think. Usually what comes to mind first is wrong. That's the whole point. But something you could think about later, whether or not it's these exact questions. But I am going to make the room really uncomfortable, okay? That's a trigger warning, okay? If you swim in the waters, if you engage in a daily or weekly ritual around pornography, it's going to ruin your life. I know just saying that word is uncomfortable, and we all kind of shift in our seats. But if we're thinking about non-cognitive ways that things affect us, this is a recent article in an online journal out of the UK around how porn will destroy you. It's probably something we know intuitively. No one thinks that porn will be doing something to you, getting into you, changing you into something that you weren't before. It's just something I look at, right? It's not, yeah. Until you served 4 years as an elder at my church like I did. I don't know, church isn't that big. We had a group of 40 people trying to get over this crap, men and women. I realize that me saying this, no one's going to actually stop looking at it. It's an addiction to some degree. But I just have to say, through a lot of good friends, marriages I've seen, young people, I used to work with a high school youth group, pornography will ruin your life. And if you're swimming in those waters, whatever it takes to stop, whether you need to talk to a teacher here, it's worth trying. Get out of those waters. It's slowly working on you. You probably know Billie Eilish. I love her music. You probably do as well. This is an interview from just a few weeks ago with Rolling Stone. Right, talk about, we're in the age of the sexual revolution, right? Even more so. This is what she had to say, right? The porn, she feels ruined her brain because she was exposed to too much. All right, so we're leaving porn behind, sorry, uncomfortableness. The second recommendation would be this. Much like in this story, there's just one person walking around making all these cognitive decisions about their life. That's not how real life works. Even now, most of you are sitting with your friends. You are not an individual creature going through this world. You are part of a community, a tribe, other people, your family, who have an influence over you, just like you have an influence over them. And believe it or not, Aristotle, of all people, wrote more about friendship than most people that we know. And he described this, that there were 3 forms of friendship. Friends based on utility, just simply usefulness. Think about this, if you're an athlete or you're in the choir or the band, you rely on other people. Some of those people may not even be friends of yours, but they are when you're on the court or when you're actually performing. That's friends based on utility. Friendships of pleasure. By pleasure, he simply means you share common interests. And some of those common interests can be really good. You like to read the same books, listen to the same music, you like the Packers, whatever it is. Most of our friendships are based on pleasure, just mutual things that we have in common. But he describes this, friendship based on virtue, the shared goal of helping one another pursue a life of purpose, and wearing the right kind of clothes. To describe that. C.S. Lewis, who most of you probably know his name, he wrote a book called The Four Loves, an entire chapter on friendship. And he said for the ancients, for Aristotle and others, friendship was the highest of the peak of human life. Really think of that, friendship, even more than marriage, Lewis and Aristotle argue. He said, but we ignore it because few people don't experience it. I kind of have friends here or there, but those friends really aren't meaningful in my life. Yeah, because you don't have friends of virtue. So a question for you could be this, and I realized in high school, I certainly didn't have high school friends like this, but man, I started to notice the deficiency in my friends, and probably they thought about me when I got into college. I could ask you, do you have friends of virtue? Friendship that just simply transcends what you have in common. Do you have friends like that in your life? Friends that share your telos, your purpose, and are willing to swim in the waters toward that purpose. I was going to tell you a story, but it would be hard for me not to get emotional, which seems manipulative, but I won't. We'll avoid it. This is off the cuff. One of my daughter's friends, someone she doesn't even know that well. It's actually a young girl from Russia. My daughter's in 3rd grade, double love knee amputee. You know what? Wearing prosthetics in the snow ain't real good. It's a tough life. There just doesn't matter how good the treads are. And we forgot to send like these short legs that she could wear at the playground. So instead, she's out there in her running blades, literally watching all of her friends play in their snow pants and stuff. And this girl she doesn't even know well took off her snow pants so she would go play with Ivy like on the blacktop. We told her, we're like, we are having that young woman over to our house in 3rd grade. That is a friend of virtue that I want in my daughter's life. Third and finally, and I know I'm past my time here, we want to avoid this. Now, it's not necessarily sloth for sloth's sake. We think of sloth as like being slow and lazy. We want to avoid the vice of acedia. You probably never heard of acedia, but that's the traditional understanding of sloth. And sloth doesn't just mean you lay on your couch watching Netflix. It means something much worse. There's an original use for acedia, for slothness, meant people that didn't bury their own dead. Consider that. Literally, these tribes 1,000 years ago would leave their dead just out and among the village. It's like, can you think of something more important? That's right. That was the most important thing to do, and they avoided it. A Christian monk adopted this term, and he said, you know what, acedia, to be slothful, means you don't care about your life or your vocation. Or put another way, that you feel spiritually or mentally apathetic. Or just like, you know. One Catholic writer says, this is really relevant today, again, for everyone from 15-year-olds to my 95-year-old grandmother. The reason it's relevant, because there's just an ambivalence. There's a kind of of my spiritual life, a lot of despair, at least I see in the high school students I used to work with. Just I can't focus. I need constant change. Man, I seek out distractions all the time. As one tech writer likes to say, and I'm going to scroll through this really fast, we do this when we scroll. I do it when we scroll. That's acedia. Scrolling, avoiding what I should probably be doing, which is anything else. That's acedia. So a few final questions for you before we actually get into the Bible briefly. I know it seems weird to back into that. Do you feel the desire to withdraw from the life and vocation that God's calling you to? Or maybe ignore it? Maybe you don't care? Do you embrace distraction whenever you can? Constant change, whatever's new, just like something new to kind of get me out of the mundaneness of my life. And finally, do you feel spiritually, mentally, intellectually apathetic or just exhausted? Know that if you said yes to any of these, and know that I, week in, week out, say yes to some of these as well. If you say yes to any of these, your heart's desires and your daily liturgies, the clothes that you're putting on, and the kind of life and identity that's fashioning in you, it ain't working if you said yes to these. We need new clothes, we need new something if you say yes to these. Or we can just stick in the same waters and feel despair and dread and distraction and just, ignorance and ambivalence towards life. So in conclusion, there's a lot of scripture that talks about this. We're going to back into it here. But Colossians is one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's a worldview text in a certain way. I'm just going to highlight a few words of this. You've taken off the old self. What do they mean by that, right? I'll let your theology teachers unpack that more. You've taken off these practices, the liturgies, the wrong orientation and desire of our heart, and we've put on the new self. But before we put on the new self, therefore, what enables us to put on the new self, what enables you to get out of acedia, and the only thing that enables you to get out of acedia and just this kind of like ambivalence and distraughtness with life, is nothing you can do. And trust me, I have tried, and I've seen guys in my church and women in my church try. The only thing that enables us to put on those new clothes that we get to eventually is that we are chosen by God, we are obedient to his call, and that he loves us before we love him. And it's through that regenerated heart that we then can clothe ourselves with all these amazing fruits of the Spirit. What clothes are you wearing? Something for you to think about in the days and weeks ahead. At the beginning, I told you about my daughters, about my concern or thought about their identity. Again, internationally adopted amputees with prosthetic legs. We've got their identity pegged a mile away, right? And I was asked once by a friend if the day that Ivy in particular, the day that she had her legs amputated after she joined us, if that was the day that marked her in our mind. And I said, to some degree. But I think it was the day before, literally that Sunday, when she was baptized in our church. And God, in his covenantal, in his sustaining grace, reached down on this little girl that we didn't even know and claimed and marked her as mine. And he did that for my other daughter as well. And we know, my wife and I, that, with the work of the Holy Spirit, through the love of the Father and the Son, that my daughters will be able to achieve any telos that they can imagine. Imagine that. Thank you.